Hello, welcome to Night School, my presentation for edu550 School Law. I'm jfarr. It became pretty clear to me when I started to do a presentation on special education and adult education that I really needed a foundation in adult education legal history and the components of adult education to even begin talking about special ed connections. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do in this presentation. Some of the beginning references to adult education can be found in the 1889 Maine legislation that allowed cities and towns to raise money to support evening schools under the directions of their school boards. And in the 1950s, the U.S. Office of Education included adult ed section under its organizational chart. Moving into the future, we see the golden years of adult ed arise in 1964 with the Economic Opportunity Act. It was here that states were given money from the federal government for the purpose of establishing adult ed programs. They were also required, the states, to provide their own funding, to develop state plans, and to issue reports back to the federal government. The purpose of adult ed at this time was to instruct 18-year-olds or older that couldn't read or write the English language. This was seen as impairing their employment options and was the impetus for this legislation. The ECEA amendments, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act amendments, expanded the purpose of adult education to those with limited English proficiency, so those learning English. It also had other components for special project grants and increased the state allotment. And there's always more. In 1970, the ESEA amendments expanded the definition of adult to include those who were 16 years old or older, and it expanded the purpose of adult education to include serving those who did not have a secondary education or a high school diploma. In 1974, educational amendments have two important developments. The first is the allotment of money that went to states was increased, but it also now was required to go to programs for institutionalized adults. And so here we see the connection to adult education and correctional facilities. The second piece is it provided for the collection and dissemination of information about adult education programs across the United States. And so this is kind of the predecessor of what is called the NRS, or National Reporting System, which every adult education program has to report into to receive federal funds. And then we have the Education Amendments of 1978, where they further revised the purpose of adult education. And I'd want to point here primarily to the third piece, where it says adult education programs will make available to adults the means to secure training that would enable them to become more employable, productive, and responsible citizens. And really, this is our first connection in the law to workforce development or workforce training for adult education. Next, we have the Adult Education Amendment of 1988. And here they actually limit the definition of adult education to those who are not enrolled in secondary school, those who are not required to be enrolled in school, and those who lack a mastery of the basic skills that in English that result in an impairment of their ability to keep employment. Of course, from there we go to the Workforce Investment Act of 1988. Title II of this act, called the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, or AFLA, aligns and improves. Next, we have the Adult Education Amendments of 1988, and here they limited the definition of adult education to adults who are not enrolled in secondary school, those who are not currently required to be enrolled in school, and those who lack the mastery of English that constitute an impairment of their ability to keep employment. And finally, Workforce Investment Act of 1988. Title II of this act, called AFLA, or the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, continued funding and reporting requirements. It helped replace all previous adult education and literacy acts, so it consolidated. And it was the larger act was part of an attempt to align and improve literacy, employment, vocational rehab, and training programs. This was reauthorized several times through 2013, and in the process established state and local workforce boards, of which adult education is a part. After the Workforce Investment Act, we see the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014. This was a continuation of the alignment of resources for those with barriers to employment and participation in society. It increased expectation for partnership across all areas, particularly among the Department of Education and the Department of Labor. It's currently the major legislation guiding adult education. So now the main legislation. Title 20A, Chapter 313 about adult education lays out the definition for adult education and defines the service system that should be in place that includes intake, assessment, advising, instruction, and individual learning plans in adult education. Of course, it doesn't list special education, but it also identifies that an adult education program must have at least 3 of the following: basic literacy instruction, or instruction in English as a second language, high school completion courses, adult workforce training and retraining, adult career and technical education. Now, of course, not all of the individual sites in Maine have at least 3 of these programs, but the application of funds as regional units or hubs within Maine allows for the individual sites to continue offering these fewer services in a rural area, and they get credit for what their hub does. And so each hub certainly offers at least all of these services and more. Eligibility for adult education in Maine is identified as following: a person who is not yet 17 years of age who is withdrawn from school, a person who is 17 years of age who is not attending school, and any secondary student who is enrolled in public day school program but is supplementing that with additional adult ed courses. So it all adds up. Adult education is not just night school. There are so many components from the federal and local legislation that make up adult education. Adult basic education, so literacy and numeracy, English language learners, adult secondary education, high school diplomas and HiSET, correctional education programs, career and college preparation programs, integrated education and training programs, and of course enrichment opportunities. Now that we've taken a good look at the history of adult ed and the components of adult ed, I want to consider what administrators might need to know about the intersection of adult ed and special ed services. While special ed services are not a part of the legislation that establishes adult education, eligibility for adult education and compulsory attendance policies mean that there is a population of students 16 to 20 who could be in adult education and are eligible for special ed services. Next, graduation with a high school diploma is seen as a termination of special education services. Unfortunately, the high school diploma equivalency diploma is not seen as a termination of special ed services. So there's a unique situation that could arise where a student is eligible for special ed services but has a high school equivalency diploma. Other intersections in adult education and special ed come around the accommodations for testing. The high school equivalency test is managed by ETS, and the pre and post test required for federal funding is managed by CASAS here in Maine. So when it comes to getting accommodations, that third party has to approve those accommodations, and the adult ed office is really only in the role of advocate for the student. In the case of pre and post testing, the adult ed site can decide not to do pre and post testing. Unfortunately, by doing so, that removes the student from the counts of NRS or students eligible for federal funding, and could impact your funding if you do it too often. The other area of intersection is around evaluation and identification. Interventions are absolutely possible at the level of adult education classrooms and services. Identifying or evaluating someone for learning disabilities is not possible. Some kind of referral program should be in place so that you can get those evaluations and identifications if necessary. When I initially started this presentation, I thought there would be a lot of hot spots between special ed and adult education. As I've gone through and learned the history, and I've come to understand what might be the issues, I don't think that's the case. Here are my final thoughts. Adult education programs have a long history of serving students with disabilities. The programs have multiple pathways for students to achieve their goals. and adult education has been serving these students well, and special education needs that are newly identified won't change this. 2. Special education won't be overly burdened by a relationship with adult education students that are potentially eligible for their services. Because of the multiple programs and the unique settings in adult education, it is far more likely that special education will refer students there. This has actually been the case in the districts that I work in. And my last thought, the increased collaboration initiated under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act has improved relationships among multiple agencies that can serve the students in adult education. When the resources are needed to meet the needs of students with disabilities, this will only help in the future. Thanks for your time listening to my presentation. I hope you found it informative.